Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to tonight's literary cocktail hour with Richard Ovenden in conversation with Peter Day. I'd just like to thank you all for your support of our LivCom events during these very strange COVID times. I really hope that together with the Masters interview and the industry events, we've managed to still make you feel part of this great livery company. And next Thursday, we have our Zoom farewell for William Alden, our illustrious clerk. So if you haven't registered for that, please do. I know that we miss each other's company, but at long last, there does seem to be light at the end of the tunnel. And those members of the company would have seen that we're beginning to organise, I say we, I mean Lucy's beginning to organise events from June onwards. So I'm really looking forward to welcoming you all back to dinners, even if it's not in our own hall. Then it will be around the city and other livery halls, and that's really exciting. However, rest assured that due to the demand, we'll certainly be continuing doing these Zoom events for the rest of this year, and we've actually got some book launches planned for next year. But in the meantime, tonight is our 8th cocktail evening, a cocktail hour evening, sorry, and we're here tonight with somebody who's not a liveryman in the company, so we've moved a little bit outside the company, but we've got Richard, and Richard is very familiar with the Stationers Company. He's a regular visitor to Stationers all over the years, and without doubt, he has a passion for both books and information, and the strapline of his book, A History of Knowledge Under Attack, is certainly of interest to all of us. Some of you have already ordered Richard's superb publication, Burning the Books, but there will be an opportunity at the end for others to buy a signed copy, and I'll give you details of that later. So please sit back, charge your glasses, and enjoy another cocktail hour with Richard in conversation with Peter. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone, and welcome this evening, yes, to somebody who isn't a stationer, but has this very close connection with what we've been doing for 500 years or so in the company. I still vividly remember how almost 57 years ago I climbed on a golden October morning the staircase to of the Bodleian Library in Oxford in order to make a solemn declaration just outside the wonderful Duke Humphreys Library of chained books, still chained after 500 years. I swore, I promised, I hereby undertake not to remove from the library, nor to mark, deface, or injure in any way any volume, document, or other object belonging to it. And then I went on, not to bring into the library or to kindle therein any fire or flame, and not to smoke in the library. So it's a particular pleasure this evening to have with us from Oxford the man who is not only the 25th Bodleian Librarian, but also the author of this terrific book, Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack. Richard Ovenden is here to tell us about the Bodleian Libraries in general and his marvellous book, and we'll come to the book later on. Do send in questions, and I'll try and squint at the bottom of the screen and put them to him as we go. But before we get to the book burning, we try to start these events with the connection, a stationer's connection. And of course, the stationers have a very strong link to the Bodleian, which you mention in your book, Richard. 10 years ago, we celebrated in some style the start of the connection with the Bodleian.
I think it's an absolutely crucial part of our history, and not just that particular moment in our history back in the early 17th century, and the role of our founder, Sir Thomas Bodley, and my predecessor, Thomas James, the first librarian, and John Norton and other luminaries in your wonderful company, but it continues to be absolutely critical to our work today. We receive both in print and in electronic form publications. 1,000 books a day is the figure that we quote, and not all of those now come in hard copy, but a very, very significant number of them do, and they support the the work of the whole university, and not just that. It's like laying down fine wine, and those books will continue to be needed, continue to be enjoyed, continue to be necessary for the lifeblood of our university, and indeed for the international community of scholars we fully expect for the next 400 years. And that's something which I personally take incredibly seriously, that we have this responsibility not just to the past, but more importantly to the future.
We not only signed this agreement with Sir Thomas Bodley to send the books, once they were registered at the stationers, off to Oxford, but also this became the basis for this thing, legal deposit, which is a major part of the way we think about libraries, the big libraries in Britain and the world now, and of course of copyright itself. This is a really fundamental thing that was done 400 years ago.
Yeah, they're absolutely intimately linked. You know, we're not the first country in the world to have legal deposit. Our neighbours across the Channel established that in the 1530s, but and indeed it took until 1710 for it to be enacted in Parliament, and that itself was a kind of there's an interesting political backstory to that, with the role of the Oxford MPs, you know, politicking around ensuring that legal deposit gets enshrined in what was an act strictly initially about copyright itself. But yeah, here we are today with you know, the regulations for non-print legal deposit in 2013. I chair the committee of the legal deposit libraries on the implementation of electronic legal deposit. I'm a director of the agency for the legal deposit libraries. You know, my implementation group would normally, in pre-COVID days, move around the 6 libraries. There's a huge number of our staff across those institutions involved in legal deposit. And then twice a year, we meet with representatives of the publishing community in the Joint Committee on Legal Deposit. And in fact, last Thursday, we had our most recent meeting. So there's it continues to be a really, really important activity for us, a kind of absolutely defining aspect of our library.
Now, the Bodleian's a big library, but what's its special role now in an Oxford where there are so many other libraries?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, actually, I'm responsible for 27 of them. So back in 2000, my predecessor, Reg Carr, led a kind of integration of all of the centrally funded libraries in the university, and we've added, there's been a number of other libraries and indeed archives have been added to our organisation since then. So it's a big organisation. I have over 500 full-time equivalent staff, and I think the answer to your question, what our role is both as a great repository of knowledge, and that knowledge is our job to steward into the future, but also to share it in as many ways as we possibly can, but also to provide a network of connection to the college libraries and to other independent libraries in the university. And we do that through our licensing of electronic resources, through our provision of catalogues and finding aids that stretch across the university. So we have all of the 38 college libraries, all of the 27 Bodleian libraries, and about 22 other libraries now, with all of their records for their published holdings in a single catalogue that we maintain. So you can do a single search and find books in just about 100 libraries in Oxford. And we have a big project ongoing at the moment. We met about it, the steering group met this morning. Your member of your company, my colleague Chris Fletcher, was you know, a key figure in that whole enterprise to do the same for archives and manuscripts. So it's that kind of, we're a kind of institution in our own right. We support all of those individuals in the student and research community in the university, but we're also a kind of a glue, an intellectual glue across all of the libraries and archives.
And you have a lot of stuff, and we'll come to that when we start talking about your book later. Just a sort of side issue is Sir Thomas Bodley's fear of fire, that pledge that I had to make. Didn't have to swear, I think. That's gone out.
No, you do. Members of the university don't have to swear, but all external readers still have to swear it, and I think we can make it available in 27 languages.
Anyway, that was because of his fear of fire, and the fear of fire really became an issue in Oxford scholarship, because you can't have candles in a library where the founder has laid down. You can't kindle fire, so the bod had to close at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in the winter times for centuries, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, absolutely, until electric light was introduced in the early 20th century.
And there was the Oxford debate, the real Oxford debate, about whether electric light was kindling fire. So that was another imposition. It essentially meant there was a lid on scholarship, no scholarship in the wintertime at Oxford.
I think there was the readership of the university was kind of smaller in those days. The Bodleian, did not introduce undergraduates until relatively late on. And the Radcliffe Library next door served a much kind of broader community for a very, really up until it merged with the Bodleian in the 1860s. So you're absolutely right. These kind of quirks of that commitment to preservation, which is what actually Sir Thomas Bodley enshrined in the founding statutes of the library and the founding kind of principle, our mission as an institution for preserving knowledge, had these kind of byproducts. But, thank goodness he did, because we haven't suffered those kind of fires and those losses, which many other libraries have. And we continue to kind of innovate in the way that we prevent fire. We developed actually a new standard for misting systems, for example, in libraries.
Tim Connell says he was studying at Oxford in the 70s when there was, of course, the famous blackouts, the electricity blackouts. So he had to study by candlelight, but not, I suspect, in the Bodleian itself. Let's turn for a moment to you, Richard. Did you always want to be a librarian?
No, that came about when I went to university in Durham and sort of discovered libraries as a student. But I've always been very, very interested in books, from being an early book buyer in my teenage years. I stumbled into a secondhand bookshop on the seafront of Deal called the Golden Hind, and the bookseller in there, a lovely man called Michael Hosking, sort of befriended me, and I discovered great books. He had a catalogue business selling modern firsts, so I encountered my first Sylvia Beach Ulysses and Kelmscott Press books and things like that there. And then but most importantly, I had the public library to support me. I didn't come from a wealthy family. There weren't many books in my household when I grew up, but I had a public library, which my mother took me to as a child. And it was just the normal thing to do, at least once a week, to go to the library and come back with piles of books.
And then as an undergraduate, you got particularly interested, and as a graduate, this was the job you wanted to do.
Yeah, no, it is. I encountered a person. I was employed one summer vacation in Durham to move the secondary sequence of my college library, and I discovered medieval manuscripts and rare books, and I was really kind of interested in them. And I went to seek advice in the university library, and I got shown to the office of a person, and the brass plaque on her door said "Keeper of Rare Books." I thought, ooh, that sounds rather good. I won't quite fancy having that title one day. And I did eventually.
Well, you've had quite a lot of titles in quite a lot of significant libraries, haven't you?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to work in, you know, a great variety of libraries and some, you know, some really, really good libraries, and to do a variety of different jobs.
Just hint as a feeling for some of the libraries you
Okay, so well, I started off in Durham, but then my first job after being a graduate student at UCL was in the House of Lords Library, where I was started off doing kind of cataloguing, but then did a mixture of kind of information and political research for their lordships. And then I moved up to Edinburgh, to the National Library of Scotland in the Rare Books Division, then to Edinburgh University as the Special Collections Librarian, and ended up merging the University Art Gallery and the University Museums with the library, and became its Director of Collections. And I moved to Bodley in 2003 as Keeper of Special Collections, and then have had a variety of roles: Associate Director, Deputy Librarian, before becoming the Grand Fromage in 2014.
What does Bodleian's Librarian? It is the most wonderful personal title, isn't it? What does Bodleian's Librarian do? Do you have anything to do with books anymore?
When I can kind of squeeze them in. So mostly it's chairing meetings, staring at spreadsheets, scratching my head about where the money's going to come from, being involved in university committees, and sort of involved in sort of running the university as a whole. I'm a fellow of Balliol College, so I have responsibilities as a governing body member, i.e. a trustee of that charity. But you know, we have wonderful projects going on. My colleagues do enormously interesting things, and I get involved in some of those through chairing, like the project we have on a new archives and manuscripts catalogue, which we were doing this morning, or digitization projects or acquisitions. Again, we were talking about a major kind of archival acquisition, and so getting involved with those kind of things gives me time to get back to the books, as you put it.
And of course,
but not enough.
You're also a publisher, or the Bodleian is also a publisher, and some bestsellers too.
Yeah, no, it's been absolutely fantastic seeing our publishing effort. And again, I give credit to Chris Fletcher, the member of your company, who is the chair of our editorial committee for the publishing operation. But we've grown our publishing operation. It delivers a surplus, a small one, back to the library. But more importantly, it creates kind of ambassadors, because all of our list is based on the collections in some way, shape or form, whether they're catalogues of exhibitions, and our big Tolkien exhibition, which travelled the world, had, you know, most sumptuous catalogue to go alongside it, or whether they're very kind of trade books. We have one which I commend to your members at the moment on the botany of gin. As the weather's getting better, I think everyone should be buying that book to accompany their cocktails. Or kind of, you know, more serious books where we publish in collaboration with other institutions, like the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies at Toronto University, for example.
Let's turn to the book now. Burning the Books, it's called. What started it? The Windrush.
Well, that was the kind of the real trigger. But there have been a number of other things kind of going on in my head in the background at the same time. So one was a general sense that libraries and archives were not valued enough in society. They were not part of public discourse enough. The concerns and issues that libraries and archives face were not really being discussed in the newspapers. And I thought, you know, how can we do something about that? You know, we also had the introduction of kind of fake news and alternative facts in the kind of Trump era, which I thought, you know, libraries and archives had a particular role to play in addressing. And then you're absolutely right. I read an account by the journalist Amelia Gentleman in the Guardian newspaper about the immigration policy being instigated in 2018 the so-called hostile environment, and the account described the Home Office, who of course were responsible for the policy, destroying a whole series of archival records, the landing cards of our fellow citizens invited to the UK, and shorthand the Windrush generation, which they destroyed in 2010. And I thought this was a kind of classic example of the social importance of the preservation of knowledge. And I sort of that very day, in the kind of heat of my anger really at that account, wrote an op-ed which was published in the Financial Times, and literally the next day, after it was published, a publisher wrote to me and said, this would make an interesting book. And 2 years later, here we are, or 3 years later, here we are.
Now, you're talking about libraries as repositories, not just silent repositories of books, but, well, speaking repositories of archives. And the archives figure very largely in the book, don't they? This is our history, our memory, our past, our present, our future, on the shelves or in boxes or something. And it's this is the absolute centerpiece of the book, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. So, what I wanted to convey was that the role that libraries and archives play on behalf of everyone in society, and that kind of key mission of the preservation of knowledge, must be valued not just for its kind of educative purpose, but, and that's incredibly important, but for defending the rights of citizens, but for bringing a kind of diversity of knowledge into the public sphere, but for ensuring the identity of communities or of society as a whole. These purposes of libraries and archives depend on that preservation of knowledge, but also on our ability to share it and make it available. So those two things go absolutely hand in hand. But I regard it really, and I try to make this point in the book, that their role should be regarded as one of the pillars of an open society, alongside the freedom of the press, alongside independent judiciaries, alongside free elections. We should have the preservation of knowledge.
And it's the destruction of knowledge when archives are destroyed that puts this into very sharp perspective. So it's a sort of passive thing. Yes, we revere libraries, but we don't necessarily regard them as frontline importance. And you're going on about the frontline importance of libraries.
Yeah, and I think what I was trying to do in the book is to show, well, what happens when you lose a library? What does it tell you? Who is affected by it, or what are the broader implications, or what were the motivations for those who wanted to destroy libraries in the first place?
Well, there are some very, very poignant stories going back into the Old Testament, or even pre-Old Testament era, right up to now, aren't there?
Yeah.
What are the most striking ones, do you think?
I being in Oxford and being in, surrounded by ancient libraries, I felt that the Reformation was particularly poignant. You only need to open the covers of a book bound in Oxford in the late 16th or 17th century. And again, this has been studied to in the most exquisite detail by another of your members, David Pearson, to find the shards of those medieval libraries and preserved in the bindings of Oxford bound books. And but these great repositories of knowledge, which Henry VIII regarded as being a kind of an arsenal to support his claims for either divorcing Catherine of Aragon or for divorcing the church from Rome, were destroyed, you know, wholesale destruction. And then you move to a kind of more poignant moments like particularly the Holocaust, and I highlight a case study in Lithuania, in Vilna, with this extraordinary group of individuals called the Paper Brigade, who risked their lives, and many of them lost their lives in trying to preserve the record of, you know, ordinary Jewish life in their city. And it goes, you know, to, you know, more recent times, you know, Bosnia. You know, my brother was in the UN in Kosovo. I mean, this is not just in living memory. This is, you know, last year was only 25 years since the massacre at Srebrenica, and yet we forget that, you know, wholesale destruction of libraries took place in Europe as recently as the 1990s.
And then there's this fascinating stuff of the Library of Congress and the British destroying the Library of Congress, and that having to begin again all over the place. Sometimes the destruction is a rather fruitful thing, because it gives an impulse to the libraries, great libraries, to rebuild themselves stronger and better.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that came out most sort of strongly to me as I was writing the book, and I hadn't really kind of thought about it like this until I was doing the research and kind of writing it down, is that those moments of destruction prompt moments of preservation. And you see that with Sir Thomas Bodley, you know, reflecting on the reasons why the medieval library of the university was destroyed, and that providing him with the inspiration to rebuild it, to, you know, because it, as he said, it lacked a standing rent for the augmentation of books for officers' stipends and for other pertinent occasions. And then in Washington, after, again, you know, not Britain's finest hour, in 1814 with the destruction of the Library of Congress, but it prompts Thomas Jefferson to offer, you know, books from his own library, arguably the most important private library in North America at the time, to replenish the stock of the nation's, you know, the library, not just of the of the legislature, but of the executive arm of government as well, and that began its kind of renewal as it is the great institution that it is today.
There's also this poignant story of the Iraqi library.
And again, it's just absolutely fascinating how much the story of libraries and archives interplay with kind of major kind of geopolitical events. And I think the Iraq is a very, very much a case in point, where there's this extraordinary individual, Canon McKeer, and I interviewed him several times. And he's written kind of extensively about his desire as an Iraqi expatriate to use archives to highlight, this is going back to the 1980s and 90s, the tyranny of Saddam Hussein. But that process of identifying Saddam as a kind of, you know, an enemy of democracy and an enemy of human rights, created the part of the impetus for the invasion in 2003 and the whole kind of spurious claims about weapons of mass destruction, which then resulted in the wholesale removal of the entire National Archives of Iraq to the United States, again, at first to help try to find evidence of weapons of mass destruction, which of course they don't, but they then end up kind of in isolation in America. And one of the things I try to do is contrast what happened to archives, the role of archives in healing a broken society in the former East Germany at the moment of unification, with individuals having access to their records in the Stasi archives, with the same not being possible in Iraq after 2003, because the archives are in America. They're in, for the most part, in the Hoover Institution in Stanford University, and it's very difficult to access them. But fortunately, actually, since my book was published, the archives have gone back. They're now back in Iraq, and it would be interesting to see how that society addresses their difficult past with those archives.
Let's move on to look at library problems in general. You talk about these in the book too. It's not just poignant stories of burnt books and lost archives. Can libraries cope with the digital world? This is a step, a threshold moment, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is. And the answer to your question simply is yes and no. So we have the technology, as they say. And I speak to you partly as chairman of, president now of the Digital Preservation Coalition. I was on the board and chairman of the board for many years. So we know how to preserve information held in digital form. We've only been doing it for kind of 40 years or so, but you know, we know how to tackle those problems. The issue that we have is the resource that's required to keep up with technological innovation, and also to keep up with the scale now of the creation of information in digital form. And that's, I think, is the major challenge, because we're off the pace already.
Exponential is frightening, isn't it?
It is, I think it is, it has potential
exponential explosion of information.
Very, very profound implications for democracy, for society, as we've been discovering in the past couple of years, in the past year, in fact.
There's another human thing that I think forgetting is part of being human, and yet that goes against everything a librarian or an archivist thinks, doesn't it? But now that is being recast in the Twitter age and that kind of thing in a completely different way. We don't want this vast burden of the past, our past, to be associated, to be deposited somewhere forever, do we?
Well, I think there's, you know, archivists have never kept everything. Librarians and archivists have never kept anything. That's part of our role, is to help society choose what to keep. And, you know, and that's for a whole variety of reasons. And not just what to keep closed for a period of time. So my colleagues in our special collections department have many collections which are kept closed for years, perhaps 10 years after someone's death, or whatever, or whether they're kept for legal and evidential reasons, but access is managed and controlled by qualified librarians and archivists. And so that process is part of what we provide, the service we provide to society. And I think we can do that in the digital age through selecting what to keep, through sampling huge data sets, but knowing what is important for the future and knowing what isn't going to be necessary to keep everything. And I think we need to be empowered and trusted and resource to be able to take on that task.
Because we've already had a presidency, an American presidency, which was largely was conducted in a social networking way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Trump era has just been
preserving that gives a librarian or an archivist enormous new problems.
It does give enormous new problems, and you know, my colleague David Ferriero, the archivist of the United States, his team trying to implement the Presidential Records Act under the Trump administration, it just, you know, enormously challenging when that particular piece of legislation is toothless. He has no real power to enforce it. But at the same time, there has been, you know, this impulse for preservation has created what I call activist archivists who've been, you know, there's a resource online, Google it, called FactBase, where you can go and find every single tweet that Donald Trump issued, and not only the tweets which were there before his Twitter account was stolen, was taken away, but all the tweets he deleted They were captured before he was able to delete them, in order to provide that record of his kind of public utterances in the public sphere. And I think that's for people at that level in our society, it's absolutely vital that we keep everything that they said.
You mention your closed bits, the bits that are dated and won't be available to scholars or users for some years. That's connected with authors and their heirs deciding what happens to books and whether indeed they're preserved. And you've got the story of Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, the story of Philip Larkin's letters in this book. And what do you make of authors deciding what should be preserved?
It's not just authors. I mean, it happens to us all. Recently my wife and I had to, were responsible for the kind of documentary remains of a loved one. And, so every family has to, at some point, decide what is worth keeping and what will our heirs find interesting or necessary to keep from the past. So these issues, these kind of curatorial issues, if you like, affect us all, and they become much more focused and significant when it comes to people of great prominence in public life in one way or another. And I think the literary examples that I gave try to sort of bring the perspective I had from the kind of national and international sphere right down to the personal one. And one must respect the wishes of individuals in these instances, but at the same time, it's worth kind of highlighting the motivations of individuals when these things happen and the implications afterwards. And I'm glad that Max Brod decided to disobey his great friend Franz Kafka's instructions to burn all his unpublished work, because if that had happened, we wouldn't have had some of the greatest literature of the 20th century. Or does one regret that Ted Hughes burned Sylvia Plath's the last volumes of her journals? Well, we would find out once and for all why he did that. We know the reasons he gave in public for that act, but without having access to the records, we won't really be able to kind of resolve the contention that many scholars have raised about it.
Of course, there are new pressures that are not about book burning, but about book blanking. The new politically correct pressure on archives and libraries. Rob Shepherd talks about the rise in cancel culture in the modern publishing world. Is there a danger of a virtual bonfire of all material that doesn't fit in with the latest woke agenda? He says it's happening even in the rare book trade. We've seen Dr. Seuss books being taken out of publication because of what they say. There must be pressure on stuff about the slave trade now. The records. What's going on? This is
I think we need to be careful about distinguishing different issues here. So there is a big difference between, not wanting some controversial speaker to have a platform with the destruction of knowledge. So there's a big difference between, I don't know, or pulling a statue down with shelling the National Library of Bosnia in 1992 with incendiary shells. I think there's a huge difference there. And I think in terms of, my attitude, my role, I think, libraries have a very important place in providing a diversity of knowledge and ideas. And that goes right through to, issues of, racial equality and so on. So we need to be able to preserve instances of racism on the one hand, but we also need to be able to preserve, copies of Mein Kampf. I'm not in the camp that says we should be taking all of those, horrible racist texts out of our libraries in order to protect vulnerable minds from them. I think libraries are exactly where they should be. We should trust our librarians to make those texts available, because we need to have the records of why the Holocaust happened. We need to preserve the newspapers of Nazism, because it's important for the future to understand what happened in the past and to have that evidence in front of us. So I can understand the concerns about the cancel culture, but I think we should separate that out from these broader issues about the destruction of, the wholesale destruction of knowledge. They're different issues.
Are these pressures, though, coming on libraries at the moment, or is it just...
I don't see them particularly myself. They've not been an issue in Oxford libraries. They're certainly in other countries. They are, Erdogan in Turkey recently leveled a library which had been set up by one of his in honor of one of his political opponents, who was a writer. You see it, in other authoritarian regimes. So I think it's something to watch out for. I think this kind of thing is, and I try to make this point in the book, that it's often a herald of more repressive actions against society. You just look at what happened in Bosnia, the shelling of the National Library of Bosnia. A few years later, thousands of people are being murdered in a concentration camp.
There's a question coming about your funding sources. I probably should have asked that when I was talking about the Bodleian, but how is the Bodleian funded?
The Bodleian is funded roughly 70% by the university as a kind of direct grant on an annual basis, and the other 30% is a mixture of our endowment, a mixture of commercial income from sources like our publishing operation. We receive one special grant from government channel through UK Research and Innovation to support our work as a, quote, national research library, and that is a kind of shorthand for legal deposit to support some of the costs that come alongside legal deposit. And then we receive kind of research grants and what we prosaically call other income, of which there's a variety and an important source of that is philanthropy.
It's because you've had a quite spectacular expansion, physical expansion recently, haven't you?
We have, yeah. Recent years, we built our big offsite storage facility in Swindon, where we currently have about 11 million collection items, and we're just very deep in planning for an extension to that, because we want to keep acquiring print and paper, and fully expect to do that. And that was funded by a mixture of the university and what was then called the Higher Education Funding Council, as a piece of kind of national knowledge infrastructure. And then the Western Library, which was a kind of refurbishment of the old, what you would remember as the, Peter, as the new Bodleian, was given a new lease of life as a centre for special collections and for public engagement. And that was funded entirely by philanthropy.
And the public engagement bit is rather interesting, because when I was at Oxford, it was the most closed-looking bit of the Bodleian. It was a sort of fortress, wasn't it?
Absolutely. No, we the great philosopher Gilbert Ryle described it as like Selfridges on top of Sing Sing, and that was something that we we wanted to change and to make it open to the public and to give access to the library, as well as to improve our fire safety and to give better facilities for our researchers and students, but also to kind of literally open the doors to the people of Oxford and to visitors.
Talk of your funding takes us to the public libraries. Dwindling in Britain quite fast.
It's an absolutely terrible situation. I mean, I think between 2008 and 2018, we lost nearly 800 libraries. I think we're probably, from 2008 to today, we're getting close to 1,000. We've seen the size of the public library workforce shrink dramatically in that period of time. And you know, we're very much in danger of losing an absolutely vital bit of public education at a time when we need it more than ever. And there's, you know, wonderful people like Bobby Seagull who are kind of very, very active as champions for public libraries. And we need to also Stephen Fry and Mary Beard and others who've you know, taken on that role, and we really need to support them. And as a place where, you know, ordinary people like myself when I was a child, whose families couldn't afford the kind of, you know, shelves full of books like I have and you have, I can see behind you, Peter, can get access to that as Milton calls it, flowery crop of knowledge.
It is about ideas. It's where the public library in a little Lincolnshire town is where I first encountered ideas, and
yeah, and people are still encountering those ideas today, and that it's still, the public library still has the power to change people's lives, and we need to absolutely support them whenever we can. Use them or lose them. How many of you have a public library card? If not, go out and get one this weekend. You can do it online. It's very easy and free.
Question from Martin Woodhead: why do UK publishers still have to supply a free copy of each book to Trinity College, Dublin?
Well, that's an interesting question. I suspect Irish publishers in the Republic probably say the same. Why do they have to supply 5 books to the UK national libraries? It's part of the, you know, it's a legacy in a way of our colonial past, but it's part of the kind of collaboration between nations. It is a kind of an anomaly in some ways, but I think as nations we all gain from that exchange of knowledge, and it is a two-way street. It's not all flowing in the direction of the Republic. Many books come back in the other direction. And at the moment, we are working actively with our colleagues there to help support the enactment of legislation which will give the National Library of Ireland and Trinity the power to archive the Irish web domain, just as we have the power to archive the UK web domain.
Neil Richardson wants to know whether electronic publishers, digital thinking publishers, feel affronted by participating in legal deposit.
Not that we found at all. In fact, quite the opposite. You know, we have many kind of small sort of independent publishers who publish essentially on the web, who are enormously grateful for us because we're providing their archive free of charge, because we archive the UK web domain at least once a year in the whole domain crawl, and for many sites more regularly than that. And so we've had numerous contacts from small publishers or self-publishers saying, you know, small local organizations, you know, local history groups, special interest groups saying, thank you for preserving our website, because it would be very difficult and challenging for us to do it ourselves.
One of the really dramatic bits of your book is the the Stasi Archives, the opening up of the Stasi Archives, because that gives a vivid feel for the archives as real, as
yes,
very human documents indeed that apply to me if I'm an East German.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if any of you have read my colleague in Oxford, Timothy Garton Ash's book called The File, which was an absolute revelationary read. It's an extremely readable book, but he was visiting East Germany as a graduate student at Oxford, and then later as a journalist. He came back on many occasions. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he, like other citizens of Germany, had the right to access his own Stasi file. And the book describes his process of, looking at that file and discovering the people who he thought were friends, ordinary East Germans who befriended him when he was a graduate student and, gave him Sunday lunch and so on, were informing on him to the secret police. And he tried to track them down and to try and find out why they were doing that. And, it's this most extraordinary act in 1989 when ordinary German citizens walked into their Stasi headquarters and stopped the secret police from destroying those records because they wanted to keep that knowledge accessible, keep it from being destroyed. And one of the leaders was an extraordinary Lutheran pastor called Joachim Gauck, who then was given the task of heading up an authority known as the Gauck Authority, which oversaw the process of ordinary people accessing their Stasi files. And he later became the president of the Federal Republic, and an absolutely inspirational figure. And it just really highlighted to me that the role of archives and their being made available, and it's true for library collections as well, is of absolutely fundamental importance for the health of an open society. If that's what we want, we need to preserve libraries and archives.
Jill Jones wants to know what the best library in the world is. Apart from the Bodleian, she says.
Oh, well, that's a very interesting, an impossible question to answer, really. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to go to many, many great libraries. The British Library is an extraordinary institution. I've used the Library of Congress myself as a researcher on many occasions. It's superb. The Beinecke, ditto, which is the Special Collections Library of Yale University. I think there are there are very terrific sort of quirky libraries. The libraries of the Clockmakers Company is a fantastic sort of microcosm of what a library should be. It's got the most niche collecting area, but it's an absolutely fabulous resource if you're interested in watch and clock making. Or there are extraordinary institutions. We did a project with the Vatican Library for 6 years, and there's no more unusual or quirky institution than that. But what a spectacular collection that they have there.
During the International Monetary Fund Conference in Washington, D.C., many years ago, I went to a Citibank party at the Folger Shakespeare Library, where there was a butler frying crab cakes on a little stove in the library itself. Now, what Sir Thomas Bodley would have made of that?
He'd have had about 40 heart attacks, I think. I was in the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow, in Poland. It was about 1986, and I was shown a Greek manuscript given to their library by John Dee, the great Elizabethan antiquary collector. And the librarian showing me this book was turning the pages with a lit cigarette in her hand, and I could just see the ash getting longer and longer as she was turning the pages. And it was the beginning of my hair falling out, I think.
What do we know, asks Julian Venables, about the burning of the Library of Alexandria?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I have a chapter in my book devoted to that very topic. And really what we know is surprisingly little. You know, what we do know is that there was no cataclysmic fire that destroyed the library. What we know from the ancient writers, but the only things really that they agree on is that there was a big library in the, you know, founded in the 3rd or 4th century before the Christian era, and that by the 3rd or 4th century of the Christian era, the library had gone. And the reasons why, how big, exactly how big it was, is, you know, highly disputed. Exactly when it was destroyed is highly disputed. Exactly who was responsible for its destruction is highly disputed. The fact that it had extraordinary collections, the fact that there was a community of scholars who worked in one of the 2 locations of the library, and I think that's another thing that the contemporary scholars agree on, was that there was the Museon and the Serapion, which formed the library, and that it had this kind of college of scholars who used the collection to create new knowledge. But that actually, I think what happened to the Library of Alexandria, and this is a great lesson for us in our contemporary times, is that it was a long process of decline and neglect and underfunding. And what started off as a great symbol of, you know, state power, of royal patronage, of prestige for the city of Alexandria and for the Ptolemaic dynasty, by you know, 600 or 700 years later, it had lost that place. It had lost the funding that went with it. It lost the royal patronage and the support, and it just decayed into nothing.
One tiny question, enormous answer, tiny question. In this digital age, you've talked about the destruction of libraries, but what about the book? Will the book survive in this? We're hurtling into a digital age where we've only just really started in it. Will the book survive? Yes,
I think the book will survive. I think the book as a physical artifact, as a codex, will survive. It's been an incredibly successful technology for more than 2,000 years. And I think that the challenge that the digital era and the ebooks posed on the form of the book and of you know, print publishing, the publishing community responded incredibly well to that. You know, books have never been more attractive, they've never been better designed, they've never been printed on nicer paper uniformly. And you know, the effort that goes into the publication of a book, and I've witnessed this myself with the wonderful team at John Murray, is awesome. And we should, you know, I absolutely value the role that the publishing world plays in the stewardship of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge. You know, we should celebrate that alongside libraries and archives. They're natural partners.
Richard, thank you so much. Inspiring and really appropriate thoughts to be hearing here at the Stationers. And talking of burning, we must always remember that the decision that the then clerk George Tokefield took to rescue most of the company archives from the flames of the Great Fire of London in 1966, rather than carry to safety the company's silver. Those archives tell us what we are, as Richard Ovenden has demonstrated so vividly this evening. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you, guys. It's a real privilege to listen to that conversation. Already, I've just had one message in saying why couldn't it have gone on longer. So, congratulations to both of you. That was great. If you'd like a copy of Richard's book, then please drop either Lucy or myself an email. It's £23, including post and packaging. And as you've heard tonight, it's a really interesting and important book, and amazingly well researched. Perhaps I can just read you a couple of the comments that people have made about the book. For me and his lot, burning the books is fascinating, thought-provoking, and very timely. No one should keep quiet about this library's history. And my favourite comment actually is from Alan Bennett. Dangerous souvenirs is what Richard calls the books, salvages by ex-monks under the nose of Henry VIII. Now as then, books need friends. This fascinating book will help to find them. And I think that's absolutely true. So please contact us if you'd like a copy of the book. Next time, we've got something completely different. Our next cocktail hour is on Tuesday, March the 30th, and we have Freeman and young stationer Nina Surveyor Moraes, whose book, Glossy, A History of Vogue, is actually published this week. And if any of you have actually read today's Times, I understand it's also in the Daily Mail and in the Spectator, you'll know that it's actually a very, very interesting read. And we're going to be in for another very interesting evening, but totally different from what we've had tonight. Nina's book is also available. We've got some copies which have all been sold, but I've got some more coming in. And again, that's £23. If you'd like one personally signed, then again, drop Lucy or myself an email. After Nina, we have Simon Esterson on the 15th of April, followed by Noel Osborne, past master Noel Osborne, on May the 10th. Then Jonathan Drury on the 17th of May, when his new book, which is Around the World in 80 Plants, it will be published. His last book, Around the World in 80 Trees, was one of our most successful book launches, and we sold about 60, 70 copies there. In addition, we still have a few copies of Angela Clark's On My Life left, and a couple of the Master Stephen Platten's books. So again, if you want copies of those, let Lucy and myself know. Perhaps I can end with the key quote from Richard's book, which is from Heinrich Heine in 1823, when he said, "Whenever they burn the books, they also in the end burn human beings." Over time, unfortunately, how true that is. And that's why Richard's book and the work he does is just so important. So finally, it's just up to me to say thanks to Lucy for the IT support, and thanks to Peter and especially Richard. It's been a great evening, so thanks everybody. Please join us for our next one. In the meantime, please stay safe. Just let's look after each other. Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Good night.